Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Can Animals Commit Crimes by Historia Civilis. Let's jump right into this reaction.
Nearly 500 years ago, in the town of Autun, France, a young lawyer named Bartholomew Chassenet.
Nearly 500 years ago. Okay, so we're talking about 1600s, the early modern era. We're slowly moving away from medieval Europe towards modern Europe, just to sort of situate ourselves in the time period.
Took on a case defending a group of young troublemakers against erroneous criminal charges brought forward by the Catholic Church. Facing off against the church was a really big deal.
It was. It certainly was. I don't know what those young troublemakers got up to, but to face off against the church, I'd worry about them. Plus, this young lawyer putting himself out there, I hope he has a good idea of what he's doing.
Especially for a young, ambitious lawyer. And after a series of clever legal tricks, he prevailed. Oh yeah, also, his clients were a bunch of rats.
What?
Let me explain.
Excuse me?
Autun's barley crop had been decimated by a rat infestation. Affected farmers asked the church to intervene, and the church, in turn, charged the rats with destruction of property in their ecclesiastical court.
Huh?
Chassenet was looking to make a name for himself, and
Okay, well, what a rather odd situation to end up in. I'm going to assume that the church was not genuinely putting criminal blame on these rats, at least not in a serious manner, but that this was some sort of, I don't know, publicity stunt, so that the church didn't actually have to solve the problem of rats eating away at the crops, and could instead gain some sort of moral high ground just from briefly inserting themselves into the problem. I mean, I'm not quite sure why else you would charge rats with any sort of crime.
and decided that defending the rats would be a high-profile way to kickstart his career.
I mean,
On the first day of proceedings, when Chassenet showed up to the courthouse, the rats were nowhere to be seen. This was to be expected, of course, but the judge's first move was to take this as an indication of their guilt. Thinking quickly, Chassenet informed the judge that the notice to appear in court had been posted exclusively inside the town of Autun. The supposed crime had taken place outside of town, so it was reasonable to assume that that's where the defendants lived as well. Chassenet argued that the court had an obligation to provide adequate notice to his clients.
I mean, this is all under the assumption that rats are actually able to read, of course. I wonder if anybody's gonna bring that up. Yeah, so my clients, these rats, they couldn't get the notice because they literally cannot read it. This is a very interesting scenario. It sort of seems like, and I could be wrong, like I said, this is something the church set up, maybe for a bit of publicity, maybe to pretend that they were actually trying to solve the problem, but now are being forced to take it seriously due to this enterprising young lawyer.
Even though they were, rats. The judge reluctantly agreed and issued an order instructing every rat in the diocese to appear in court. This time, notices would be posted everywhere. Several days later, Chassenet showed up to court for a second time, and again, his clients were nowhere to be seen. The judge was prepared to call it quits right there, but Chassenet came back with another argument. He said that whenever farmers appeared in court, they were usually given several weeks to get their affairs in order. His clients were farmers of a different sort, so why weren't they being shown the same respect?
Wow, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, this guy's kind of spitting facts. Of course, the rats need time to get their affairs in order. They've got families to leave behind, crops to eat. They need to make sure all of their rat business is in order before they come to court. Brilliant argumentation from this lawyer here.
Chassenet was being annoying, but he kinda had a point. The judge delayed proceedings for several weeks so that the rats could get their affairs in order. Whatever that means. Weeks later, they met for a third time. Surprise, no rats. Chassenet burst in there full of beans. He informed the judge that of course his clients had every intention of coming in today. However, he had only now discovered, to his dismay, that the streets of Autun were absolutely crawling with cats.
Oh my god.
Chesney said, were afraid.
Dude, this guy is pulling every trick in the book to get these damn rats off the hook.
For their lives. The judge was allowing assassins to hang around outside the courthouse. This was unacceptable. He told the judge that it would be impossible for his clients to appear in court until every cat in Autun had been moved indoors.
I mean, that's fair.
An extremely annoyed judge issued a notice for people to
Yeah, I got to imagine that this judge came in here, all right, we're going to make a stand against these rats. I cannot imagine he genuinely believed that he could hold the rats responsible in any real way. And yet this lawyer has come in, and now this judge has to indulge a series of ridiculous requests. I mean, requests that would be reasonable were these clients humans, but of course they are not, they're rats. But in this case, I guess the thought process of this young lawyer is, well, if you're bringing these rats to trial, you're treating them like any other client, then we need to offer them the protections offered to any other client. And I mean, I guess fair enough.
Please with sugar on top, move your cats indoors. Proceedings were adjourned until a future date, TBD. No date was ever set.
Wow.
People moved on with their lives, and the matter was set aside.
The rats
Cassidy
won.
had successfully badgered the church into dropping the case.
I mean, to be fair, a win against the Catholic Church at this time, that is quite impressive. The church still holds an immense amount of power over the lives of ordinary people, and I suppose ordinary rats as well. And these rats, along with their skilled lawyer, have just won a victory against the church. Not bad.
So, that's a weird story. We could just leave it there and move on with our lives. But it does raise an interesting question. Can animals commit crimes? Why did the people of Autun try to bring the full weight of the law against something that was so clearly just an act of nature?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Of course, in effect, animals can commit what might be viewed as crimes. They can do things that will be harmful to other animals and other people. But I think where we hit the roadblock is the question of intent. You know, as far as we can tell, animals have no intent to commit crimes maliciously, or at least have no intent the same way that a human would, right? No understanding necessarily of what they're doing, and so we do not usually charge them in court.
Believe it or not, to answer this question, we have to go all the way back to the ancient Greeks.
Wow, okay. A little Historia Civilis connection there. You know, his latest videos we've been going through have been a bunch of different topics, but here we have a connection back to Historia Civilis' bread and butter, the ancient world.
Murder trials in ancient Greece were held out in the open air. Every flavor of murder trials. By that I mean human murder trials, inanimate object murder trials, and yes, animal murder trials.
Well, I mean, to be honest, of those three, you know, the least reasonable would seem to be the inanimate object murder trial. So if we're talking about animals, that's not even the worst of the three offenders here.
The principle at work here is that the Greeks believed that murder disrupted the moral equilibrium of a city, and that it created a sort of unseen pollution that seeps into every aspect of society. That's why they held their murder trials out in the open air. You don't want innocent people breathing in those murder fumes.
Right, I mean, literally, of course, that isn't what happens, but I do honestly think that is a pretty good metaphor for crime. Literally, murder doesn't cause some sort of noxious gas that poisons everybody, but metaphorically, that is kind of the effect it has on the community, so I would say not a bad description, to be honest with you.
But why for inanimate objects and for animals? The pollution imagery is key to explaining this. The Greeks made no distinction between an accidental and a purposeful killing. It made very little difference to them whether a death came from a person with a knife, a falling roof tile, or a kick from an animal.
Interesting. So the way the Greeks dealt with it, basically, there is no question of intent. They have removed that from the equation. They don't care what the intention of the murderer was, who they were, why they did it, was it on purpose or accident. All of that is out the window. What they care about is the result, the outcome. What effect did this event have on the world, the community, or the individual person who was murdered? That's obviously a pretty interesting way of looking at it.
In each of these scenarios, it would have been classified as a murder, and each murder would have emitted unseen pollution into the community. If enough of this unseen pollution built up over time, it might result in a plague, or a crop failure, or a natural disaster. The fate of the entire community depended on keeping this pollution to a minimum. So how did they do this? Simple. Murderous, inanimate objects and animals were put through a formal trial, and if found guilty, they were expelled beyond the borders of the city. This act of expulsion was thought to cleanse the city of its unseen pollution.
Yeah, I mean, we've already seen a rat trial, so maybe that's beginning to be normalized, but I'm particularly interested in the trial of an inanimate object. I mean, how exactly is an inanimate object, or even a non-human animal, going to defend itself in this circumstance? I mean, do they get a lawyer, like in the rat trial that we saw?
This tradition persisted for a long time. It eventually spread to the Roman world, where it came into contact with the early church.
Yeah, well, if there's some sort of a Greek practice, a Greek religious practice, cultural practice, belief, whatever, it's probably going to make its way through the Roman world. I mean, the Romans loved to take any Greek idea they saw and incorporate it into their own culture. So, no surprise that this particular tradition also made its way to the Roman world.
Flash forward to medieval Europe. By this time, the church still believed that animals could commit crimes, but the rationale had evolved.
Okay.
Like the Greeks, the medieval church believed that the act of murder somehow infected the entire community. However, their version of this came not in the form of unseen pollution, but instead in the form of evil forces. Sometimes this evil was explicitly described as demonic or satanic.
I mean, I will say, to be honest, both the way in which the Greeks and medieval Christians look at murder, I think they're really just trying to conceptualize and understand something which actually is true. The idea that crime and murder would poison a community, the effects would radiate out beyond the perpetrator and the victim. I think this is something that is absolutely true. They are just trying to understand it in a far more literal sense, whereas we might take what they believed and use it as more of a metaphor to describe sort of the sociological process that we might see happening. So, like many beliefs throughout history, I think this is really a way of understanding and rationalizing something that actually happens, the actual effect of crime on a community. They're just making it more literal than we might.
And sometimes it was a little more vague. To put it simply, the medieval church's position was that evil attracted evil. One murder brought evil forces into the community, which made a second murder more likely. A second murder did the same, and made a third murder more likely. It was a vicious cycle that had the potential to destroy an entire community.
Yeah, I mean, they
So
could be
how
right.
did animals play into this? For theological reasons, the belief was that animals were slightly more susceptible to evil than humans were. When an animal committed a violent act, it was an early indication that worse things were in store for the community.
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably say the opposite, right? Because when I think about evil, I would think of negative consequences, plus the intent to act maliciously. And to me, the animals really do not have that intent, so they cannot be evil. I mean, they can create negative consequences, but not from some malicious intent to do so.
Whereas animal trials in ancient Greece were an act of cleansing, animal trials in medieval Europe were an act of deterrence.
Okay.
Animal trials in medieval and early modern Europe were divided into two distinct categories.
I will say, I'm kind of surprised I've never heard of this, because we think about the same time period, and we have some extremely famous trials. I'm particularly thinking of the witch trials, which were very popular in Europe around this time, and then, of course, were brought to the New World, the American colonies, and were popular there for a brief time. And we hear all about the witch trials. You know, they're sort of a big thing in our cultural view of this era, but I've never heard about animal trials. I mean, perhaps because animal trials are even more ridiculous, and also because we feel a lot more sympathy for the individuals who were unfairly killed in witch trials versus animals who were punished in animal trials. But yeah, or maybe it's something else. I don't know. I've just never heard of this sort of event.
Categories. There were animal trials in the secular courts and animal trials in the ecclesiastical or religious courts. The secular courts dealt exclusively with domesticated animals: cats, dogs, horses, pigs, whatever. The argument here was that domesticated animals were servants to humanity and could therefore be considered members of the household. Under this worldview, domesticated animals were subject to human law, just as any other member of the household would be.
Okay.
The ecclesiastical courts, on the other hand, dealt with...
I mean, I think how we might view that is that perhaps an owner of a domesticated animal shares some of the responsibility for what that domesticated animal does. We wouldn't necessarily pin the blame on the animal itself.
creatures that were beyond human control. Rats, locusts, termites, snakes, stuff like that.
Yeah, though, of course, if we look at this in a Christian and religious context, things like rats and locusts have been seen as sort of evil little creatures. And in some ways it makes sense. I mean, rats in particular are plague spreaders. And so if you don't necessarily understand how plague works, or you're looking for a godly, a religious, a Christian perspective that might help you understand that, you definitely might point the blame at those little plague-spreading rats.
As we've seen, the belief was that animal crimes had to be prosecuted so that evil forces were deterred from seeping into the community. When it came to domesticated animals, the courts were perfectly capable of treating them just like any other defendant. However, that was not the case when it came to rats or insects. How is one to properly evaluate which rat destroyed which crop, or which specific termite caused a roof to cave in? It was an impossible task. Fortunately, the church had tools that the secular courts lacked.
Okay.
Excommunication and exorcism. This was handy because it was
the excommunication or exorcism of a rat. Now, that is very curious.
fairly simple matter to excommunicate a swarm of locusts, for example, without having to physically interact with them.
So does that mean that a regular rat or locust would be a member of the church if they can be excommunicated? I mean, what are the implications here?
Bartholomew Chassenet defended the rats of Autun in ecclesiastical court. So, just for kicks, let's take a look at the trial of a domesticated animal that took place in secular court.
Okay.
In 1474, in the city of Basel, an egg was discovered in the pen of a male rooster. Settle in. Get out your detective hat, take some puffs on your pipe, because this one's a stone cold whodunit. The people of Basel figured it out pretty quickly. The rooster laid the egg. A small minority of you might have another solution in mind, but that's just your dumb, tiny brain being a stupid idiot.
Of course.
Obviously, this was the work of the supernatural.
Must have been.
But here's the important bit. It was a crime for a rooster to lay an egg. Rooster eggs were believed to be ingredients in a spell that could be used to create a basilisk.
Oh, wow.
Wait a second. That's,
Yeah, what's going on here? You know, there's something a little deeper. You know, put on your tinfoil hats. I think there's something a little deeper going on here.
This is all very silly, obviously. But think back to the
Silly? Yeah, that's what you think. I'm not so sure.
theoretical model that lay behind medieval and early modern animal trials. Rooster eggs were all tied up with magic, maybe witchcraft, maybe even Satanism, which meant that a rooster laying an egg was an evil act.
Yeah,
if
no
they
good.
allowed something like this to go unanswered, other evil forces would seep into their community. The unfortunate rooster was charged with the crime of cavorting with Satan. The rooster's lawyer argued that, sure, his client laid an egg.
So it was a regular thing for animals to have lawyers in court. The example of the rats was not just a one-time example of an enterprising lawyer doing maybe something a little silly. This was a regular occurrence. Or maybe I shouldn't assume that, but it happened more than once. So that's already pretty crazy.
And sure, rooster eggs were used in magical spells, but the act itself, the laying of the egg, was entirely involuntary. Since no spell had been cast, no evil act had actually occurred. If no evil act occurred, deterrence was unnecessary. This was nothing more than a simple act of nature. It's a clever argument, but it didn't take. The prosecution argued that it was irrelevant whether or not the laying of the egg had been an involuntary act, because it was technically possible that some kind of demon had physically entered the body of the rooster and laid the egg for him.
Yeah, I mean, not to mention that this is literally a rooster, and so, I can't imagine he was thinking malicious things in the first place. Also, of course, this whole thing is ridiculous, The rooster must have laid an egg. Oh, well, okay, sure, if you say so. And perhaps a demon may have crawled inside of him and done it for him. Well, we are quite beyond the bounds of reason and logic at this point. I don't know what I would argue if I was the lawyer of this poor rooster.
They argued that, voluntary or not, a rooster laying an egg was an evil act under any circumstance. And so long as this crime went unpunished, the entire city was in danger. The prosecution's argument won the day. The unfortunate rooster was condemned to death and burned at the stake.
Wow. Did they eat him? And I mean, that's sad for the poor rooster, but also, if we think about the families that own these animals, say you're a small holding family, you have a small farm, maybe a couple of roosters, you lose one of them. Maybe you're a family that has, say, one cow that you milk to feed the whole family, or maybe sell the milk or make it into cheese, and your cow does something evil, and your cow is burned at the stake. That could be a serious economic blow to your entire family. So there are real consequences here.
But not everybody was cool with putting animals on trial. Over this entire period, there was a ton of work going on behind the scenes to rationalize and reform this system.
This just reminds me a lot, and I mentioned it earlier, of the witch trials. And perhaps that's because the witch trials are my and most people's only exposure to law and the courts of this era. But the odd rationalizations, the use of sort of religious reasoning, the talk of demons compelling people to do things, it is very reminiscent of the witch trials. And like with the witch trials, in the case of witches, there were skeptics. A lot of people doubted even the existence of witches, or the prevalence of witches. And there were people who spoke up during these witch trials and said, yeah, I think there may be a more secular explanation for this. And I'm sure the same thing was occurring with these animal trials.
A lot of this work, especially early on, was actually happening inside the church. Thomas Aquinas spends a lot of time in his 13th century work, Summa Theologica, tackling the nature of evil, and more specifically, the nature of evil in nature. He eventually arrives at the position that the natural world is inclined towards perfection. But that isn't to say that evil doesn't...
And, of course, the animal trials are a little ridiculous. They especially appear ridiculous to us, but they do touch on deeper issues, which we're hearing from the rather famous Thomas Aquinas, the nature of evil, the nature of nature, right, of animals, the, evil in nature, or is there evil in nature when bad things happen? Well, is that evil? Is that how it's meant to be? Is that an act of God? Is that an act of Satan? there's a lot of much deeper questions that go really to the root of Christian theology and that have been debated for a long, long time that these animal trials sort of touch on a little bit.
Exist in the natural world. Clearly it does. Aquinas says that when an animal performs an evil act, it is in a way malfunctioning or somehow deformed in their nature. He goes on to say that taking these creatures out of nature is fine, but since nature is inclined towards perfection, this should be extremely rare. In other words, he's saying that animals should only be charged with crimes when there's something very clearly wrong with it. Nature is inclined towards perfection, so in practice, it should usually be fine to just leave animals alone. This is a pretty modern perspective, and it's remarkable that something like this was coming out of the church in the 13th century.
Yeah, I was going to say, Aquinas was writing much earlier than some of the trials we've been shown today, so it's clear this was a debate that had been going on for, at least a couple hundred years, even when we reach the 15 and 1600s.
So the theoretical groundwork had been laid. According to Aquinas, animal trials should be rare. But sadly, this argument did not catch on. In fact, in the centuries following Aquinas' death, animal trials actually became more common than ever.
Really? Wow.
Here's a typical example. In 1379, near the town of Saint Marcel in Burgundy.
It seems like France was really having a lot of these animal trials. What was going on in that area?
A herd of pigs became overexcited and trampled a young boy. He later died of his injuries. Think back to Thomas Aquinas. Were these pigs somehow deformed in their nature? It's hard to say without being there, but probably not, right? It sounds like it was just a tragic accident.
Yeah, and that's how we would interpret it today. If someone is killed in a situation like this, we would see it as an accident. Of course, the animals didn't understand what they were doing. They had no concept of committing a malicious and evil act. Now, sometimes if one particular animal, particularly a dangerous animal, murders someone, we might put that animal down. But I think we would usually explain that more as making sure nothing like that happens again in the future. It's still not necessarily assigning blame to the animal, or it's not necessarily intended as punishment to the animal, though of course it is. It's intended as a preventative measure for the future. But of course, I think as we're about to see, the people of this era did not necessarily think that way.
But the town did not follow Aquinas' lead.
Right.
The three pigs who did most of the trampling were brought into secular court and sentenced to death. The town was still not satisfied. They returned to secular court for a second bite of the apple and argued that actually the rest of the pigs had demonstrated by their squealing and aggressive behavior that they approved of the young boy's murder.
Wow.
They were accomplices. The judge bowed to public pressure.
This really does make me wonder, what understanding people of this era had of animals. What did they think was going on in the brains of these creatures? It seems like they overestimated the intelligence of these animals, or perhaps the amount that these animals would have thought similarly to us as humans. Whereas today, we have quite the separation between human beings and, every other kind of animal.
And sentenced the rest of the herd to death as well. The prior at the local monastery was bothered by this. He didn't think it was right for the town to execute all of its pigs over a tragic accident.
It's unfair to the pigs, but to touch on something I mentioned earlier, you got to imagine this would be quite the blow to this town. Economically, maybe they're intending on slaughtering and selling some of those pigs. Also, just in terms of living, they might need those pigs to survive, to eat, right? So slaughtering all the pigs is probably bad for the town itself.
He wrote to Duke Philip the Bold of Burgundy, explaining the situation and asking him to pardon all but the three main pigs.
Wow.
The Duke agreed. The rest of the herd was pardoned and the matter was settled. What's interesting about this incident is that it shows how the church and the nobility were working together and pushing for moderation, and how normal people were pushing the courts toward maximalist punishments.
Yeah.
Animal trials persisted for centuries. Many came to view it as a superstitious holdover from the medieval period, but nevertheless, it was a practice that would not die.
I mean, that's how a lot of people saw the witch trials. The witch trials survived, a lot longer than I think a lot of people expected, and by the time they were slowly sort of tapering off, a lot of people felt the same way, that witch trials were superstitious nonsense, witches didn't exist, they were a barbaric holdover from the medieval era, but even with a lot of people believing that, they still continued for a fair amount of time.
In the 17th century, the philosopher René Descartes spent a lot of time and effort making the argument that animals were wholly incapable of committing any crimes whatsoever. His argument went a little something like this. All animals are automatons, meaning that they have no sense, no feeling, and no inner life. A phrase that he likes to use over and over again is that animals only follow the disposition of their organs.
Yes, and of course our thoughts have developed since René Descartes, but given the importance of someone like Descartes, we can sort of see the formation of our modern view of non-human animals, right? A lot of the stuff he's going to say here will be built upon over the next couple hundred years and will result in how we view animals today. This is already very different from the view that clearly a lot of people felt during his time and before his time, and this is what is going to lead, like many of the ideas Descartes had, lead in one way or another to our modern day beliefs.
According to Descartes, a creature acting purely on instinct is in perfect accordance with nature, and is therefore incapable of evil. Descartes argued that putting animals on trial was meaningless, no different than putting inanimate objects on trial.
Well, wait a minute. The Greeks might have something to say about that, because they also put inanimate objects on trial.
Which is funny because that's exactly what the ancient Greeks used to do.
Yep, exactly.
Descartes' successors picked up this argument and ran with it.
Yeah.
People continued to argue about the nature of evil and stuff like that, but the basic worldview that said that it was meaningless to charge animals with crimes actually caught on.
Yep, and that's the point I was making. That is basically what most of us believe today, even though there is still a big debate, both in the Christian world and, of course, outside the Christian world, on the nature of evil.
By the 18th century, animal trials were becoming less and less common. By the 19th century, they were a novelty. So, medieval Europeans saw humans and animals as operating within the same moral universe. Descartes and his Enlightenment successors rejected this worldview and argued instead that animals were incapable of moral agency, operating entirely in reaction to the disposition of their organs. In the 19th century, the pendulum swung back in the other direction. Charles Darwin and his successors made a series of discoveries that turned the basic Enlightenment worldview when it came to animals on its head.
Yeah, this animal trial stuff touches on a lot of deeper topics, some really fascinating stuff on our view of ourselves, humans' view of humanity, and to what extent there is a separation of humans from other animals. And the Enlightenment thinkers absolutely made a big separation between humans and all other animals. They were very big on the perfectibility of humans, human self-improvement, humans continuing to move upwards, become more educated, more enlightened. And then, of course, as we move forward, we get a lot of other ideas introduced into the mix, not to, of course, mentioning here Charles Darwin. Natural selection, sort of the popularization of evolution as a theory. We evolve from other animals, right? And we have common ancestors with a lot of the animals we see today. And so it gets very complicated. It's a very interesting debate over sort of the place of humans in our world. Interesting stuff.
In The Descent of Man, Darwin writes that so long as animals hit a certain baseline of intelligence, quote, any animal whatever, endowed with well-marked social instincts, would inevitably acquire a moral sense or conscience. This was a straightforward rejection of the Descartes and Enlightenment worldview. According to Darwin, animals are not automatons. So long as they possess some intelligence, they are capable of full moral agency, no different from humans. Since the Darwinian Revolution went back to arguing that humans and animals operated within the same moral universe, you'd think that this would reignite the medieval and early modern practice of putting animals on trial.
Well, no, because Darwin wasn't quite arguing the same thing as, say, medieval Christians did. He argues that an animal with enough intelligence would have some sense of morality, but I think he would also agree that at this point, humans are the only animals with that level of intelligence, right? We don't have other examples of animals that have reached that level, right? So I don't think he would advocate for putting animals back on trial.
Thankfully, it did not. By the 19th century, the practice had been in decline for at least 100 years. People were a lot less worried about an evil act precipitating some kind of metaphysical threat to an entire community. Instead, they went the other way with it. Since animals were now believed to possess full inner lives, Darwin and others pushed for preservation and compassion whenever possible.
Yeah.
Before too long, most of Europe had outlawed the public execution of animals. Legislation dealing with animal cruelty quickly followed. By the 20th century, virtually in the blink of an eye, the practice of putting animals on trial had vanished from Europe. Which is good.
Yeah, I'd say so. Alrighty. That was a very interesting video. I really didn't know where it was going. My camera's having an issue focusing on me right now. There we go. I had no idea where it was going, but it ended up touching on some pretty interesting stuff about the nature of evil, the position of humans in the world, animal rights, fascinating stuff. And like he says, we've been led to the position we are today where, most of us don't ascribe any sort of morality to animals. But I think a lot of us also believe that we should treat animals as well as possible. Or some people might say we should treat animals as good as is convenient for us. But there is a fairly strong animal rights movement, anti-factory farming, all that kind of stuff. The animal trials seem a little ridiculous, but the idea of animal rights and, animals' place in our society versus humans' place in our society and how we should treat animals, a lot of that is still up for debate. Still up in the air. Certainly not a topic that I'm an expert on, nor one that I'm particularly well read on, but it is interesting. So yeah, this video touched on a lot of that. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Next in the playlist is the Battle of Agincourt, and like the Siege of Jerusalem, that is going to be a Patreon channel member exclusive, so you can either join as a channel member or join up with the Patreon if you want to view those videos, plus a bunch of other Historia Civilis videos that are Patreon channel member only. And then after that, we'll move on to Can Monarchs Commit Crimes? That'll be our next public video. And I can see from both the dates listed and the video afterwards that it's about Charles I, which is something I know... I don't know a ton about, but I know a lot more about that than I do animal trials. So I think that will be an interesting one. So yeah, stay tuned for that. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.